Hi, I'm Andrew Tsao. In this episode of Backstory, we're going to see 23rd and Union, a docudrama that investigates the 2008 murder of a popular Seattle restaurant owner. The film uses the murder as a vehicle to discuss gentrification and the tension between young African-American men, Ethiopian immigrants, and gay couples that are now living in Seattle's Central District. With us today is a very talented young filmmaker, Rafael Flores. Rafael, welcome to Backstory. Thank you so much for coming up and joining us from the Bay Area.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you back in Seattle. So tell me a little bit about the backstory for yourself on this film. How did it come to pass? What was your first involvement after the event that made it become a film?
Yeah. So Philly's Best was a very popular restaurant in the Central District. Ever since I was born, I can remember it's always been right there on the corner of 23rd and Union. And the original owner was actually murdered in the parking lot. And then a second owner who was his apprentice, who was an Ethiopian immigrant named Safi Desasha, or sometimes AKA Safi Berecha, took over the restaurant. And he was a beloved figure in the community, and he was actually a personal friend of mine and friends of lots of people I know who lived in the community. And he was always known to be very generous and and offer free food to people in the neighborhood to help the homeless. And he was actually murdered in 2008. And when his murder happened, actually on the cover of the Seattle Times, there was a picture of many people from many different backgrounds and cultures that gathered together for his memorial.
This was a photograph of the memorial.
Photograph of the memorial. And when I saw that picture, it inspired me because it was the first time that I had seen so many different people from so many different backgrounds gathered together. And I thought that if his death could bring so many different people together, that perhaps this film could do the same.
I used the word docudrama to describe the film. I actually think the film is more than that. It's bigger than that. It has a very unique style. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to thinking about this particular form to tell this story?
Absolutely. So the film actually operates as my my master's thesis for San Francisco State University, where I got my degree in cinema production and directing. And as a requisite for that master's thesis, we're supposed to conduct research. And so it started with a lot of interviews with a lot of people in the community that knew the parties involved and who are personal friends of mine and whatnot. And so as I was gaining my research throughout this project, it was always intended to be a narrative. But then what happened is that I started to realize that a lot of the adaptations that I was creating actually were ending up to be true through my interviews with the people in the community. And so, in a way, in an attempt to have the form fit the content, which in my opinion most great films do, I tried to create several different worlds in the film, 3 different worlds to be specific: the documentary world, the narrative world, the fictional world, and an in-between surreal world, which actually is aimed to actually challenge the spectator to question the representations of various stereotypes that you see throughout the film, and to look behind the truth and look at yourself and look in the mirror and see what role we all play in gentrification and how that affects youth, such as Rico, our main character, or aka Ray Davis Bell, who committed the murder, and for us to all really be accountable for the violence and the actions that take place in our city and in our communities.
So these 3 points of emphasis came together and sort of were your guide in putting the film together, these distinct areas that you were focusing on. As you went through the project, and I can only imagine, once you get on the ground and begin to encounter the real people and you have a personal connection to it, things must have changed. Things must have revealed themselves that you didn't expect. What were some of the things that surprised you in going in and making this film that you just didn't expect when you first went in?
That's a good question. So the first thing that I didn't really expect was how defensive a lot of the community actually were with the representation of their own communities. And I think that it's interesting when you look at gentrification, because essentially everybody's competing for their own community's resources and space. And that's essentially every scene in the film is about competition for space and resources. And so, for instance, when I was casting, I spent two months casting for this film, and I was surprised to see that, first of all, a lot of African American men did not feel comfortable playing gay characters.
Okay.
I also thought that it was interesting that a lot of Ethiopian actors weren't as excited or motivated to actually act in a film, because in immigrant communities it's often not viewed as an acceptable profession.
Okay.
Because, you know, as many immigrant families and parents want their children to come to the United States to live the American dream, to become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. And so it was surprisingly difficult to find actors for the film, and that was one of the challenges. But also the role of the Seattle Police Department was also a very interesting role and surprise to me, because during the production of the film, the police were called on us about 5 different times, even though we had permits from the city of Seattle that guaranteed that the Seattle Police Department was informed about the production, yet the neighbors in the community kept on calling the police on us even after we had actually consulted them and informed them that there would be a production going on.
We're producing this film, we have our permits, the city is aware of it, and yet they're calling the police.
And in general, I think that it's important to recognize that, because the lack of neighborly sentiment in the neighborhood is actually precisely what this film is about.
Well, it's interesting because what we're talking about is, you know, so much of the tension in the film is about specific cultures colliding in one space, and a filmmaker going into that community represents yet another culture, a culture with eyes and ears that's looking to find the truth. And of course, people are going to be protective and very concerned about their own self-image on film. Ultimately, though, you did end up right in the community making this. I mean, your locations are real. You're not shooting things on sound stages, even though there's drama and fiction in it. It's definitely a part of the reality there. So, what was the sort of experience once you got there, and you know, did it turn around? Was there a point where, oh, you know, we maybe misunderstood this? In other words, how much time did you spend when you're making this? And then let me sort of follow up on that, because, you know, the first few days, there's these strangers in town, they're doing this. Did it change over time? Did people begin to welcome you and open up a little more?
Well, first off, I was born and raised in the Central District. So people know me there. And our media collective, Green Eyed Media, was co-founded, or it was founded in Seattle in 2006. So the presence of Green Eyed Media in the Central District was very well known. Oftentimes I have my crew wear, you know, some of the fashion that we have, which have our logo on our shirts and whatnot. And so, and I would say pretty much everybody was very excited and always very interested in what we were doing and what we were shooting, especially considering the fact that we were shooting right there on the corner of 23rd and Union, which is completely transformed now. It doesn't look the same, by the way. And so there was a kind of rush and imperative sense of trying to complete the film before the entire building was remodeled. To remember to pay tribute to Safi and his restaurant, and always remind people of his legacy. And so there on 23rd and Union, you're filming, and so your sense is that the concerns from the community really were about fear of how they'd be depicted. Is that what you'd say? Yeah, I would say so. I think that in particular the people who participated in the film, who were actually witnesses to the murder, it was a very traumatic experience for them, and to go back and revisit these memories was kind of operating as a therapeutic exercise for themselves, but also for myself and my relationship to my community, after seeing so many of them African American families and friends of mine that had actually had their houses foreclosed and had to move further south into areas of Tacoma and Kent. So it was a therapeutic exercise in terms of me confronting the frustration I've had, and essentially feeling like an alien in your own neighborhood and constantly being profiled everywhere you walk through. Right.
Now, I'm not going to give it away, but you know, you touched a little earlier on the police being called on you. There's also a scene where you depict an encounter with the Seattle police. Did you have to go through anything specific to make that happen in terms of you know, using their image, if you will, on camera?
Absolutely. The Seattle Film Department was a bit concerned about that when I kind of proposed this idea, and the police didn't like it. They don't like the way that they're portrayed in the film, but I always reminded people that when we made the film, it was actually right after the murder of 4 police officers in the area, actually. And it was also right after a young woman was punched in the face by the police department right in front of Philly's Best, where we shot the film a week
Which is in the
before,
film.
Which is in the film.
Yeah.
So definitely, I think that the city of Seattle probably didn't like the portrayal of, for instance, the bus, the metro transit system as well.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm the type of filmmaker that I have to speak my mind, and I didn't make this film for any type of profit at all. I made it because it was a film that needed to be made at the time, and I think that I can't censor myself in any way.
So you doggedly pursue the idea of having to, for example, shoot on that bus. I mean, what's the tipping point? How do you get permission for that? Is this something that you had to just, you know, did you steal a bus in order to do this? I mean, how did you ultimately convince the people we're talking about to come around and say, okay, you know, go ahead, you can use it, as opposed to just no chance, we're not going to let you depict us at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a form of community filmmaking, first of all, and I think that if these institutions were not going to allow us to do that, then I'm the type of filmmaker that would directly insert that narrative into the story and the process of filmmaking itself. So, and that beyond that, I think that for the most part, the institutions were very understanding of it, and I think that in Seattle, people understand that artists need to express themselves, and the things that we're talking about are realities that I don't think many people can deny.
Right. Well, before we look at the film, Rafael, as I said in the beginning, you live in the Bay Area, but you have very close ties because you grew up in the Central District, but you also have close ties to the University of Washington. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I grew up on the University of Washington's campus. My father is the chair of American Ethnic Studies here, and so I would always sit in on a lot of his classes, and at an early age I was exposed to a lot of Chicano cinema, which is what he specializes in, and it actually, in order to actually study that, I was enrolled into the Comparative Literature and Cinema Studies department here, and at the time there wasn't really many outlets for filmmakers to actually practice filmmaking in the university setting because of the lack of a traditional film school here, and also the lack of an MFA program also in the state of Washington. So after I finished my studies here at the University of Washington, I actually had to move to California to get to pursue that degree, an MFA, so I could teach. And
so a combination of influence of watching Chicano film through your father's classes and your own interest in cinema here at the University of Washington results in the filmmaker Rafael Flores.
Absolutely.
What other influences?
What are their influences? So during and that's actually something that's very interesting because the Cinema Studies department here at University of Washington has a great national cinema program. And so I took a lot of Filipino cinema, a lot of Russian cinema, a lot of Latin American cinema, and this led me to discover the third cinema movement from a particular professor named Kiko Benitez here on the campus. And Kiko, I did my undergraduate honors thesis with him, and I studied the relationship between third cinema and producing that in the first world. And for those that don't really know what third cinema is, it's actually a cinema that decries neocolonialism as a form of filmmaking, or neocolonialistic filmmaking practices as a form of spectacle and something that impedes collective action. And so many of my films and much of my work is an attempt to create third cinema within the first world, and particular reference to the idea of internal colonialism and how gentrification operates as an internal mechanism of segregating people, but also developing small colonies and dividing and conquering communities of color.
You know, this is a topic that ranges into the area of, you know, what we call the democratization of media in our time, meaning that, you know, we were talking a little bit before we started rolling the cameras about, you know, when I was your age, it was a very departmentalized, institutionalized training, obviously with film cameras, and expense, the difficulty of acquiring equipment and crew, all of those factors were barriers. Now, almost anyone that can get themselves to a Best Buy can get their hands on a pretty decent video camera. And then we've also seen that distribution and control of the content has changed. I mean, we saw that in the last decade with the music business, the demise of the labels and artists directly communicating to their audiences. Well, you know, now with Vimeo and YouTube and all the outlets, filmmakers are now able to directly access and communicate with their audiences. Would you say that has been a major influence on how you think about making and putting your work out in the world?
Absolutely. So one thing that I like to remind people is that even though we have this digital revolution and cameras are easily accessible, for a lot of communities and young people of color, you might as well be saying that's $1 million because they're not going to, I myself can't even afford a camera. And I don't own a camera. So what the important thing in terms of community filmmaking is really depending on your peers to help you. And it's oftentimes a lot of filmmakers trade favors. And this sense of kind of supporting each other and to empower each other and to collectively speak together is something that's absolutely essential to a lot of my films. And I really don't like to depend on the commercial film industry to support myself because oftentimes you have to take a job that you necessarily don't feel passionate about. And for me, I think that filmmaking is really an outlet to really express my, my views about the world that I see around me. And oftentimes, because of the commercial pressures, those ideas change. And
so let me get this a little more defined for me. When you say community filmmaking, you're not just talking about films that deal with community issues. You're also talking about a structure by which the film is made, I'm hearing now.
And distributed and screened as well.
Okay, can you define some of that for us so I can understand it better?
So community filmmaking to me is not only just a form of production, but also the way that it's distributed and also screened to the public. And so a lot of the films that I create are actually geared for discussions afterwards. And so 23rd and Union is a perfect example of that. It was sold out through a large campaign of grassroots promotions and hitting the streets, passing out flyers, talking to people, having conversations with people. And as a result, it was very successful actually. And it was an alternate mode of kind of distribution as well, because when we do this, we actually sell the streets hand to hand directly to the public and at the screenings as well. It was also marketed with the soundtrack, and the soundtrack actually succeeded in its own right. And so these types of strategies are kind of alternate ways for independent filmmakers to actually collaborate with musicians as well to link the industry.
Sort of cross-pollinate and find new ways to help each other.
Exactly.
And so, you know, we have in our minds in this country, when you think of film premiere, you think of a red carpet and you think of all the paparazzi. I'm going to guess that the venue itself was somewhat radical as well. I'm guessing you weren't doing premieres like that. Were you in community centers when you were screening this? What were those? What was the context of that?
Absolutely. So the two largest proponents in terms of screening the film was Langston Hughes, Langston Hughes Cultural Center, and their annual African American Film Festival, which sponsored the film, but also Central Cinema, where it premiered actually, and it was 2 blocks away from where the actual murder took place. And Central Cinema is a local theater that's meant to support filmmakers from the Central District. And so it is an alternate route and form of screening to the public. And I think it was very important to premiere the film there because it directly spoke to the population that the film was about, and it served as a space to candidly talk about the issues in the community.
Do you by any chance, 30 years ago, Francis Coppola, in an interview, was asked what the future of American cinema was. Do you know what his answer was? This is 30 years ago.
What's that?
A kid from a small town in Kansas with his own camera. A lot of foresight from him there.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back, and we're going to watch 23rd and Union with filmmaker Rafael Flores. Welcome back. We're going to watch 23rd and Union, and be sure to stay with us afterward to hear more from filmmaker Rafael Flores. We'll be back in a minute to talk with filmmaker Rafael Flores. Stay with us. Welcome back. Rafael, you open the film with the killing of Safi. You go back and recount the events that lead up to it. And while you're doing that, you use a mix of styles or filmmaking strategies. There's documentary footage, there's narrative scenes you've put into it. There's even direct address, where a character will step out of the scene and actually address the audience. You know, it just kind of got me thinking a little bit about the history of different styles of docudrama. Earlier we were just chatting about Godard and the early days of the French New Wave. I also thought a lot about the Italian neorealists after the war, when, you know, things were in a very difficult state, and they were like, how do we do this? Well, we won't use actors because we don't have them. We'll just use real people and create some scenes. This got me thinking as I looked at the film. Rafael must really be a student of the form and really have some strong opinions and thoughts about the cinematic space and the way he wants to put it together. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So theoretically, there's a lot of theoretical research behind the film in terms of not only social sciences, geography, but also the film form itself and film history. And for the most part, a lot of my cinematic style was influenced by three sources. The first one would be Bertolt Brecht and Brechtian cinema.
Yes, which would we could say the idea of direct address turning out in the scene was a very signature moment in the epic theater of Brecht, where the actor would step outside of character and comment on what the character has just done.
Yeah, essentially breaking the fourth wall.
Yes.
Is what it's called. And also his agit-prop mode of agitating the spectator in order to promote or propagate a new way of looking at the social realities that we are in.
Yeah.
And the film, in that sense, is not meant to, you know, make you feel good. It's meant to agitate the spectator, to promote a discussion after the film. And I think a lot of people sometimes have a trouble kind of understanding that. So that's the first form. And might I mention that agit-prop and Bertolt Brechtian aesthetics was also adopted by El Teatro Campesino, the first form of Chicano theater, which led to the Chicano cinematic movement, which was practicing what I call rascuache aesthetics. And rascuache aesthetics is making the most out of the littlest means. And I think it's very imperative that a lot of independent filmmakers understand this. And this is something that's part of my research and some of my future publications, which I plan on coming out with. But also, and most importantly, I would say, in my opinion, the third cinema movement of the 1960s and 70s, which was first born in Argentina and Latin America and then spread to Asia and Africa, was probably the most influential source of cinematic history that has influenced a lot of my work. And for the most part, what they do is they talk about how neocolonialism can take many different types of forms. And sometimes when I bring up the idea of internal colonialism, people think that these ideas are outdated. Why are you studying?
Or there couldn't be that happening in a country like ours.
Exactly. But when you look at the Trail of Tears, if you look at the Japanese internment, the Mexican repatriation, and even the Native American reservation system, you'll see that internal colonialism is very alive and well.
So how does third cinema thinking fit into that?
Well, third cinema oftentimes is relegated just to the third world, right? But if we really look at the first world, we'll see that these same practices are being developed here in terms of globalization, for instance, is another example of it. But also, if you look at communities of color and gentrification and how they're being pushed out of the urban centers into this, just further out of the city, their access to resources and health care, and also mental and psychological state is really what's important, because a lot of people don't think of gentrification as a health issue. And if they do, they usually think of it in terms of access to health care. But in reality, and this is the foundation of the research behind the film from one of my colleagues and mentors, Professor Frederick Murphy of the Morehouse School of Medicine and the CDC, was one of my main collaborators in the film. And he based, in his research, which I based a lot of my research on, was the idea of the psychology of displacement. And how the psychology of displacement actually produces mental illness in the form of alienation and disorientation. So a lot of the strategies in terms of breaking the fourth wall in the film are meant to share that same alienation with the audience.
Right. So filmmaking in this regard almost becomes a visual way of representing a state of being or a condition that people are actually living in. And that sounds like it's a big part of third filmmaking in that way. So you're mixing color, black and white, sound effect, soundtrack. Often you will cut in a certain sort of a rhythm that follows a narrative, and then you'll jar us out of it with a moment. And so I'm going to suppose all of this goes into the idea of helping us see film in a different way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, yeah, definitely seeing film in a different way as a tool to really promote action and to promote discussion, I think is really it's important, because we can discuss this as much as we want, but if we don't actually act upon it, then the fruits of my labor are really in vain.
It's interesting you talk about part of the film itself is meant to not end when the film ends, but to actually promote an event after the film that's a community event. And that is something I think that's really a powerful notion. You know, we're so used to in the corporate world of cinema, you go to a movie, you watch the film, the credits roll, the lights come up, it's as if it didn't happen. It was 2 hours where you went somewhere and then you went back to your life as it was. You're talking about a kind of filmmaking that actually says the film itself is not isolated. It's not just a piece that you can observe and walk away from. It's a part of something, and it's speaking to you in that way as a member of the community to take action. Is that something that when you reference the history of Teatro Campesino, et cetera, is that something that when they did their theater pieces was also part of, you know, the way they made those was part of it to get the audience, the live audience afterwards, to stay and actually talk about the piece?
Absolutely. So El Teatro Campesino was actually used as internal mechanism for the United Farm Workers movement in Cesar Chavez, and that led to the empowerment of the working class Mexican community and Chicana community in the fields in order to secure equal wages, benefits, and in general just a state of human condition which is equitable and according to the Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah. So your company and your organization, you're setting up a kind of template, a kind of role model in a way, if you will, for potential and possibility in communities. What are we supposed to do? I'm just sitting here thinking, geez, talking to Rafael, I never really thought about this, but I can probably help get some cameras into that neighborhood. Is that something from your point of view as a filmmaker you're also trying to promote? Get those voices happening, let young people feel like this isn't something that you have to have a Panavision camera and a grip truck, an electric truck to go out and do something, that you can actually tell your stories with very little. How do you do that with your organization?
Yeah, so the organization was born in 2006. I co-founded it with a fellow musician, and I actually started as a musician and then couldn't support myself as a musician and had to switch over to filmmaking. And together we collaborated, and the vision was to create workshops that were hosted by several community centers all across Seattle, and it was born in the Central District. And right now we have expanded to the Bay Area, Oakland, and San Francisco, and also Los Angeles. And ultimately we'd like to establish offices and satellites all across the West Coast, from Canada to Mexico, because I'm a tri-citizen and I can actually own property in Canada and Mexico.
So what would be the kinds of things, if I'm a teenage kid growing up in some of those communities and I came to your organization, or I showed up and volunteered for you to help you make a film, what would I learn? How would you sort of make what you're talking about palpable and real for them?
Well, that's funny that you asked that, because right now I'm currently working in East Oakland for a nonprofit called Youth Uprising, and that's essentially what we're doing. And it's a multi-million-dollar facility that's created through public funding and private funding and also grants to empower the youth in really depressed neighborhood. And essentially, I've been using them as a model for my own company because they're operating on a much larger scale. And what I would say to some of the youth that are interested in that, and I have had youth from Eastern Washington actually reach out to me, and as a filmmaker, I always think it's important to engage the youth that come and reach out to you, because that is the future. And I think that if I were to say, hey, why don't you come work on one of our productions, which I have done, I would say, let's take it to the streets. I'm gonna show you how to make guerrilla filmmaking.
Okay.
I'm gonna show you if you can't afford permits,
Yeah.
if you can't afford cameras,
I'm
I'm
gonna
gonna
show
show
you
you
how to do this.
Exactly, and making the most of the littlest means, which is the whole Chicano aesthetic that came out of El Teatro Campesino, with literally taking signs and saying, this is my character's name, and putting it around my neck, because it's more important that the ideas that you communicate are more important than the glossy aesthetics that you present. And I think in a lot of film schools, we often get distracted by this spectacle.
Of course. I mean, I think that some of the problem is, as a teacher myself, I encounter a lot of this sense of, what's most interesting is the look in the form rather than the content. And I'm constantly saying, doesn't matter how good it looks or sounds if the content and the thinking and the purpose behind it doesn't have integrity, doesn't have, hasn't been thought through, and it's ironic that in today's age, like I said, with YouTube and everything else out there, I mean, there's video everywhere, but isn't it interesting? The percentage of it that has good content is still small.
Absolutely. And if you go to Hollywood, even the mainstream audience and producers and film industry will tell you, story.
Yeah.
So that's not really something that is just unique to independent filmmaking or green-eyed media, but it's really something that all filmmakers know and promote. And I think that,
I tell you, the thing that's really exciting about what you're saying is, I don't know how many students have said to me, yeah, I wrote this, or yeah, I did this, but I can't do it because I don't have enough equipment or whatever. This notion of saying don't use that as a barrier, use it as an aesthetic is revolutionary and brilliant in terms of filmmaking. What's next for you, Rafael? What's happening film-wise for you?
Yeah, so I'm working on a lot of projects right now. The ones that are probably most relevant to Seattle would be the autobiography of Aaron Dixon, one of the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. He's approached me and he wants to turn his autobiography into a documentary, and I'm going to try to use that same docudrama aesthetic to try to communicate the legacy of the Black Panther Party in Seattle. But more recently, other than that, I'm also going to be releasing a film in about 2 to 3 months called The Blank Canvas, Hip Hop Struggle for Representation in Seattle, which essentially explores every facet of hip hop culture, from fashion to graffiti to music to DJs and producers to even to the radio industry, to really explore the struggle of independent artists here in hip hop, in the hip hop community here in Seattle, and to investigate why hasn't Seattle really adopted a very definitive type of identity within the larger hip hop community, and how it's perceived to be a blank canvas, but in reality there's so many colors being painted on that canvas that it's a collage of so many different diverse voices.
That's a really interesting statement, because depending on who you talk to, you'll either hear, why hasn't Seattle made its mark in the hip hop community? You can't identify a Northwest hip hop. But then there are other people who say that's not true. It is. We just haven't gotten the attention that the LA, Chicago, New York, Bay Area people have, and that's been the problem. So it'll be interesting to see what you find out as you do this.
Absolutely, and it's going to be marketed just like 23rd and Union with the soundtrack, and all the information can be available on greeneyemedia.com.
Great. So last question. I am a young filmmaker from perhaps a depressed neighborhood, and I have dreams of telling stories. This is my chance to say to you, Rafael, a role model, what do I do now? I'm just out here in the middle of nowhere. What should I do?
I would say, first of all, especially to a lot of my students, I say they don't want you in the film industry. That you are a marginal identity. They do not want those voices being made in the mainstream. And I would say, if you're like me and you like to resist and you like to rebel and you like to go against the system, then you have an obligation to make these stories and to share them with the world. And that's what I would say to youth. And I'd also say that don't think of it in terms of money, because money will come. Just do what you love and money will follow.
That's really inspirational, Rafael. Thank you very much. And thank you for being on Backstory with me today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Backstory. I'm Andrew Tsao, and we'll see you again behind the scenes.